My name is Kim Lowther. I'm with Prince William Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm their education specialist, and I'll be introducing our guest speaker today. This is Dan Schwartz. He holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Maryland and Virginia Tech, respectively. Since 2003, Dan has worked as a soil scientist for the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. His first years with the district were spent outdoors doing field work to update the Fairfax County soil staff. Since then, his work responsibilities have broadened to include education, technical consultation to county agencies, soil and stormwater research, erosion and drainage assistance to Fairfax County homeowners, and implementation of the district's residential grant programs. Dan lives in Reston with his family. So do I.
Thank you. Yeah. Came from the Prince William Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm from the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. So we got district folks all over the place up here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for choosing this breakout session. Hopefully I'll make it worth your while. Obviously today is about native plants. I'm going to be talking about soil. It's not exactly the same thing, but you probably have a pretty good idea that you can't really get one without the other. Or to have good plant growth, you have to have fairly decent soil to be true as well too. So the focus of today's presentation is going to be how to strengthen your soil and improve the overall health of your soil beyond your simple fixes like adding fertilizers and things like that. This is trying to be a bit more of a holistic approach to soil. So, without further ado,
Page down or page down.
there it is. All right, so again, when we're looking out on the landscape, especially if you're looking at it with a gardener's eyes, which most of you are, what is on top is very obvious. You can see the diversity of plants, the diversity of animals. Sometimes we have, your pollinators buzzing through your plants as well too. But this diversity is relying on this invisible network of ecology that is occurring just below the ground surface. It's a very busy, active ecosystem in the soil, but it's a little bit of a mystery to us because I think as all humans are somewhat visual people. Some people are more visual learners than others, but we like to see things. When you see things, you can understand. The problem with the stuff that's living in the soil is that you can't really see it. Obviously, you can go dig a hole if you want, and you can see the burrows of earthworms, you can see the plant roots themselves, but even if you were to actually dig down into the soil, much of this would still be invisible to you because a lot of it is microscopic. So taking a step back, thinking a little bit more about concepts. What is soil really? We can think of soil as being the skin of the earth. And the earth, all matter can kind of fall within these three conceptual spheres. We've got our hydrosphere, our lithosphere, and our atmosphere. The hydrosphere is all of our water, from our oceans to our rivers to the bay, to much smaller bodies of water, little ponds, creeks, droplets of groundwater, water vapor up in the air making our clouds. All of that falls under the agglomeration of hydrosphere. We've got our lithosphere, which is basically our solid rock and the sediment that weathers from that rock, which is basically polarized rock. No matter where you are in the world, if you dig down, you will eventually hit bedrock. Around here in the Manassas area, you only have to dig down about 2 to 4 feet to hit bedrock. If we go about 15 miles to the east into Old Town Alexandria next to the Potomac or Mount Vernon, we have to dig down maybe 200 or 300 feet in order to hit bedrock. So it varies a lot from spot to spot, even over small distances. But you will eventually hit that rock, and that's your hydrosphere. And then, of course, there's the atmosphere, which is the air above us that we're breathing right now. And where all three of those spheres intersect spatially, at the skin of the earth, that's where we find soil. And it's important to keep this concept in mind because our hydrosphere is our water, our atmosphere is our air, our lithosphere is our rock, and our sediment that forms from that rock. Combining all three of those together makes soil. We think of soil as being a solid, but really, it is the majority solid material, or I should say plurality solid material. But there's a lot of air and there's a lot of water in soil, which are just as important ingredients for a healthy soil. And if we were to look at a nice, healthy topsoil and break down its constituents into a pie graph, it would look a little something like this very simplified version right here. We have about 25% by volume water, 25% by volume air, and the other 50% would be solids. This is a little surprising to people. When you think of soil, you think of a solid, Look outside, got these 100-foot tall sycamore, oak, tulip poplar trees, they're all anchored in the soil. So even though the soil has a lot of air and water in it, we think of it as a solid because it's pretty solid in the perspective terms. I mean, it's strong enough to hold up the weight of those trees. Those trees don't knock over with every single gust of breeze that happens. So it's got a lot of strength to it. But surprisingly, only 50% by volume of our soil is. We can break that down even a little bit further. Of those solids, 5% of the soil by volume is organic material, 45% is mineral material. And the air and water, again, still 25% each. So this is sort of your basic recipe for healthy topsoil. I do emphasize healthy because that's not necessarily what you have in your property. If you have healthy soil, it's going to look something like this. In urban areas, we have a lot of compaction, urban soil quality problems. So as a result, not all of our soil is going to look exactly like this. But this is sort of the goal to aim for. Let's talk about those soil solids a little bit. So even though it's only 50% of the soil, those soil solids are very important. And honestly, when people are talking about soil, what we're really talking about usually are the solids. We say, oh, okay, thick clay soil, it's a real pain to garden in it. That's an indirect reference to the percentage of soil solids. Usually when we're talking soil, we're not talking so much about the water in the air. So kind of a way to communicate from one person to another about soil is comments on the soil solids. We can break down the soil solids into those two fractions. The mineral fraction, 45% of the soil by volume. There's the organic fraction, 5%. We can break those fractions down even further. By mineral fraction, we basically mean three things: sand, silt, and clay. That is what solid rock breaks down into when it's in the process of forming soil. And the difference between sand, silt, and clay is just the particle size, the diameter of the average particle. There are a couple of different ways that groups measure this. If you ask an engineer, they'll tell you that sand, silt, and clay is something a little bit different than what a gardener would say. Most gardeners, landscapers use the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition of what constitutes sand, silt, and clay, and that's shown up here. So sand, don't feel like you have to memorize these numbers by any means. It's just a means to show you the different sizes. Sand is any mineral particle that's 2 to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. Silt is 0.02 millimeters. And clay or any particles that are less than 0.002 millimeters. It's kind of an awkward measurement, 0.002. What does that really mean? That's the same as 2 microns, 2 millionths of a meter. So if you imagine that meter, 3.2 feet long or so, cut it into 1 million equal slices. We got some sort of specialized knife. Put 2 of those millionths together, and that's the diameter of the largest particle of clay. And they get a lot smaller than that too. So clay, extremely microscopic. You'd have to use an electron microscope to see an individual particle of clay. Silt, microscopic, but significantly larger than clay. And then sand kind of bridges the gap. Larger particles of sand you can see with your naked eye without the magnification. They're smaller, 0.05 millimeter sizes. You will have to have some sort of visual microscope in order to see the individual grains. But in the long run, sand is a lot bigger than silt, which is a lot bigger than clay. So even though they're all small to us compared to the human body, there's a tremendous amount of difference in the sizes when comparing one to the other. That's 45% of our soil right there, sand, silt, and clay. The other soil solids are the organic fraction, and we can break that fraction down into living material and dead material. The living material are things like beetles, worms, the roots of the plants themselves, but more frequently, it's stuff we can't see, the microscopic stuff, bacteria, fungi, and other smaller, multicellular, but very, very small insects and other critters. But particularly the bacteria and fungi, that makes up the bulk of the living organic material in soil. If we have that nice, healthy topsoil, 50% solid, 25% air, 25% water, every teaspoon of that topsoil is likely to host anywhere from 100 million to 1 billion bacteria. So got a couple handfuls of topsoil in the palm of your hand, you're probably holding more individual lives than there are people on Earth. For fungi, it's a little bit different. So most the fungi in soil is multicellular, and it takes the form of these little tiny root hairs, called them mycelium or hyphae sometimes. An individual root hair is a hyphae, the whole mat of hyphae together are called mycelium. Sometimes these are macroscopic. You can see them. If you go out into the woods and you take a couple of the layers of leaves off the top, and you look at some of those decomposed leaves down below, sometimes you'll see these little white lines running through the leaves. Those are visible mycelium of soil fungi. But most of the mycelium isn't visible because it's microscopic. So in that same healthy teaspoon of topsoil, we were able to somehow extract all of those fungal hyphae and lay them end to end to end. They would stretch anywhere from about 40 yards to 40 miles per teaspoon. So there's a lot of stuff living there, we just can't see it. What we usually find too is that soils underneath forests are usually a bit more dominated by fungi, because fungi really like to break down solid woody wood, things like dry, crispy leaves, twigs, branches, things like that. And that's what's falling on the surface of your forests. The soil in pastures, in agricultural fields, in gardens, in meadows tend to be a bit more dominated by bacteria. They tend to like grasslands and disturbed areas. But dominance is a relative thing. No matter what soil you have, whether you're in a pasture, whether you're in a grassland prairie, whether you're in deciduous forest or in your garden, there's still going to be billions of bacteria and miles of fungal roots working their way through that soil. And perhaps just as importantly, there's the dead organic material. And the reason the dead organic material is important is that's what feeds the living organic material. All those leaves we see falling on the ground during autumn, those eventually break down. How are they breaking down? They're breaking down because the critters in the soil are decomposing, especially again, the bacteria and the fungi. And the reason they're doing that is that's their food source. They're getting energy from that decomposition process. So forest floor is like a buffet for microbes in the soil. Taking one step back, going back to the manure fraction, there is a very important soil physical characteristic called the soil texture, and it's determined by the soil solids. Soil texture is very simply the percentage of sand, silt, and clay that we find in the soil. And soil texture is important. I mean, we call it texture because it does affect how the soil feels. Why does a clay soil feel very sticky and dense? Well, it's a sandy soil feel loose and good. It's a reflection of the texture and unique characteristics of sand versus silt versus clay. But that's not the only reason it's important. It has a very large effect on important characteristics of the soil, especially the retention properties of that soil. The ability of that soil to retain and hold water, the ability of the soil to retain and hold nutrients, and something we call infiltration, which is how quickly oxygen and water can go from the surface and pass down, percolate into the soil, absorb into the soil. Water retention, nutrient retention, and infiltration are all strongly affected by the soil's texture. And this is a very simplified graph that shows what some of those characteristics are like. So if you imagine that we had some sort of special control slider bar, like a mixer on a record player, and that somehow we could change our texture of our soil. Put the slider bar all the way to the right, that soil becomes 100% clay. When you move it all the way to the left, it becomes 100% sand. And in the middle, it's some sort of loam that's a mix of sand, silt, and clay. What happens as we start monkeying around with the texture, adding more sand, subtracting sand, adding clay, subtracting clay? Well, the first one shows you the general relationship between water holding capacity and your clay and sand content. So as you go from no clay to 100% clay, what we'll see is that the more clay you have in your soil, the more ability that soil has to retain water. Clay is very absorptive. It's like a magnet for water. Just one of the reasons why clay soil can feel so heavy and dense. It's attracting and holding a lot of water to itself. Sand, on the other hand, is very porous. If you've ever been to the beach and seen the waves cross over the sand, what happens to those waves? They infiltrate. They pass down into the soil very, very quickly. They absorb down into the sand. So the more sand you add to your texture, you go from 0% sand to 100% sand. The water holding capacity of your soil reduces quite a bit. Sandy soil allows water to pass through very, very quickly, but it doesn't hold that soil. It just passes right through and then down onto the groundwater below your soil. Nutrient holding capacity has basically the same characteristics, the same pattern that we see. Start adding more clay to your soil. Clay can both hold water and can also hold nutrients. A lot of dissolved nutrients, they're ions, they have some positive or negative charge. Clay also contains a bit of charge, usually a negative charge. So a lot of those positively charged ions are attracted as a magnet and bond, not permanently, but bond temporarily to the surfaces of clay. Clay does have some ability to attract negatively charged ions out of water as well too. So the more clay you have, the more of that attractive force you have, the more of those dissolved nutrients will bond to the surface of that clay. So more clay usually means more nutrient retention. Sand again is the opposite. Sand is fairly inert. It doesn't have those charges that clay has. You add more sand to your soil, there's less ability of that soil to hold or retain those nutrients. And then lastly, we get to infiltration capacity. This is where the relationship reverses. Obviously, the more sand you have, the quicker water and oxygen will move from the surface down into your soil. The more clay you have, you tend to get stickier, more massive, denser feeling soil. When you have a heavy rain on top of a really clayey soil, what happens to that rain? A lot of it just sits up at the top, becomes stormwater runoff, or becomes a puddle. And that's because clay does not allow water or oxygen to pass through down into the soil very quickly. Clay is great at retaining stuff. It's not very good at allowing that stuff into the ground in the first place. It's a bit of a problem because you can solve some problems in your soil by adding clay, but you're also creating new problems as well. You can make your soil more infiltrated if you have more sand, but it also means you can't hold on to material very well. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The other thing about texture is there's not really any way practically to change it. If you have a clay soil in your backyard, I'm afraid to say you're stuck with the clay soil. Unless you want to pay, 30 truckloads of, dump truckloads of sand and spread that through the top 3 feet of your soil. I guess you could theoretically do that and change your texture, but I wouldn't recommend it. There's other simpler ways to fix the problems that come about as a result of a kind of an extreme texture, really clayey soil or really sandy soil. The organic fraction is extremely important for the health of the soil. The organic fraction is going to be kind of the emphasis of the rest of this presentation, because the organic fraction, unlike texture, is something that you can change. You can change the amount of organic matter in your soil. You can change the types of organic matter in your soil. Texture, you're pretty much stuck with what you've got. The organic fraction, like texture, is very important because it has a large effect on the ability of the soil to hold water, to retain nutrients, infiltrate water and oxygen from the surface down into the rooting depth. Plus, it also plays a very important role in the soil's nutrient cycle. And perhaps most importantly, it is something that can be changed through good management. Texture, you're stuck. Can't really change it through any sort of management except for really extreme measures, which I don't recommend that you take. Organic matter, you can change it fairly quickly through normal management of your soil and the crop. What does the organic fraction do for the soil, conversely for us? Well, again, that organic matter is the base of the soil food web. It's that raw material, that raw organic carbon that gives everything else that's living in the soil its energy. So here's another simplified illustration. Even though it's simplified, there's still a lot of arrows going in various directions on this illustration of the soil food web. But as I said before, soil is a very important and complex ecosystem. When you ever have an important complex ecosystem with a lot of different species, a lot of parts playing their role, you're going to have an equally complex food web. Food web is just simply a way to illustrate how energy transfers from one level of the ecosystem to another. Organic matter is the base of the soil food web. So dead organic matter falling off the trees, like the dead leaves you see in autumn, twigs and other things that break off during windstorms, the grass blades that you leave on the surface of your lawn after mowing, and the roots of plants themselves actually exude or push out organic matter into the soil as well too. Animals die, animals drop manure, all this stuff becomes organic matter that sits on the soil surface and gets incorporated into the soil. All this organic matter is the base of the soil food web. So things start breaking it down and attacking it as soon as it lands on or gets incorporated into the soil. Really, the first level of consumers, I should say, in the soil food web, we kind of break down into 2 categories. And the role that they play is they're sort of the organisms that process that raw organic matter that's being deposited into the soil. We have the decomposers. As the name implies, they break down organic matter. These are the bacteria and the fungi. So they're the highest numbers that we'll see of any of the levels of the soil food web. Billions and billions and billions of bacteria, miles and miles and miles of fungal roots. Then there's another little smaller group called the shredders. That's a perfect name for them too, because what they do is they take big chunks of organic matter and they shred it into smaller sizes. That doesn't seem like it should be that important, but it really is, because when you shred something up, you introduce a lot more surface area to that material. When there's more surface area, it's much easier for the bacteria and the fungi to attack and decompose that organic matter quickly. If you think about your own compost pile, what happens if you throw a log in your compost pile? It will decompose, but it's probably going to take 4 or 5 years. If you take that same log and grind it up into wood chips and throw that into the compost pile, those wood chips will probably be gone by the end of the first year, as long as you have a little bit of nitrogen in them too. But the only difference between them is that you're taking that one big solid, chunked it up into little tiny pieces, and greatly increased the surface mass or the surface area that can be attacked by bacteria and fungi. That's what the shredders do. They basically pre-chew the food that they decompose and break down, if that makes sense. And the rest of the soil food web, I'm gonna do them disservice and just lump them all together as the liberators of nutrients. One of the really cool things about bacteria and fungi is that they tend to accumulate a lot of nutrients in their body, especially nitrogen. Bacteria in particular love a nitrogen-rich food source. And in their body, they have about 8 parts nitrogen, 1 part nitrogen to every 8 parts carbon. Now, when our protozoa, our predatory nematodes, roundworms, or arthropods, or birds, or any other predators consume material from the soil, they're consuming either inadvertently or advertently a lot of bacteria and fungi as well too. And that's giving them energy. They're actually eating. We think of, earthworms as kind of working their way through the soil, just making burrows. But what they're actually doing is they're eating the bacteria and fungi that's on those soil surfaces and getting energy from them. So all these predators in the higher levels of the soil food web are dining on those bacteria and those fungi. And when they do, they're getting organic carbon, which is giving them energy, and they're getting that really concentrated source of nitrogen and other nutrients. However, these guys, they don't need nearly as much nitrogen as they're consuming from those bacteria and fungi. So what happens when you have an excess of nitrogen in your body or any other material? You excrete it through manure. Why is manure such a good fertilizer up on the land? Because it's full of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all those other good things, which tend to be enriched in animal waste. Same thing happens in the soil food web. These higher level predators are eating those nitrogen-rich bacteria and fungi. They're using the nitrogen that they need in their own body, and they're excreting that excess through their waste. And what this ultimately does is it takes nitrogen that used to be locked up within the bodies of bacteria and fungi. Before that was locked up within the raw organic matter that bacteria and fungi ate. They're excreting it through wastes and turning it into a form that can dissolve in the soil water. That's really important because plant roots only take up 2 things from the soil. They take up water and they take up oxygen. They're not extracting any solids. They're not actually sucking up any little particles of soil. They're drinking water and they're breathing oxygen. So the plant gets any nitrogen or other nutrients from the soil. Those nutrients have to be dissolved in the water first. And that's what these higher level predators within the soil food web are doing. They're taking that nitrogen that was locked up in the bacteria and the fungus, they're eating it, and they're excreting the extra in a soluble form that can dissolve in the water, and then it's available to be taken up again by the plants. So that's where the real nutrient cycle comes. The bacteria and the fungi sort of take the nitrogen and other materials themselves, they give it up to the animals that prey on them, and those animals excrete extra in their waste that then dissolves and goes back into the plant roots as those roots soak up water from the soil. Yes.
What are the predators you're talking about? Is that the nematodes? I can't really read all that, but.
Everything else.
All those other things are in the soil.
Because even things that aren't specifically preying on bacteria and fungi are inadvertently eating a lot of bacteria and fungi.
Right.
So, if that bird is eating a roundworm or a flatworm or an earthworm, they're getting energy from the body of the worm, but that worm is full of good beneficial bacteria too, and that worm is also getting energy from that bacteria. So everything basically eats the lower level stuff, whether they're trying to or not. And then there is one small subset of the soil food web that I want to talk about too, And that's the nutrient collectors. And that actually is a specific type of soil fungi. So let's talk about them. So you might have heard the term mycorrhizae before. That's a specific, not a type, it's actually, well, it is a type, but there are many types of mycorrhizae. It's not like it's just one fungus. This is a picture of a pine seedling. I did my best to draw out the roots of that pine seedling. So it's those big, thick T-shaped roots kind of in the middle right there. But you see that huge mass of other finer roots that are spreading out in all directions. What those are not the actual roots of the plant itself. Those are mycorrhizae fungi. So again, this is a class of fungi that has this mutual parasitic relationship. I'll call it parasite, but it's not really. It's because it benefits the plant. But basically, these mycorrhizae fungi invade and infect plant roots. And when they do, they send their own little fungal roots out into the soil around that plant root. And these fungal roots, as you can see from these little white lines, those are the hyphae that we were talking about. They have a much larger reach than the tree's roots itself. So they, in effect, extend the area, the volume of soil to which that plant has access. Yes?
Do you mean more like a symbiotic relationship?
Symbiotic, yes, symbiotic mutualism, exactly. That's a good word. What the mycorrhizae fungi do, then their roots are very good at extracting water and nutrients from the soil. They bring it in and they send it to the plant. The plant's very happy about this. So what it does is it creates energy through photosynthesis and it sends carbohydrates down into its root to feed the mycorrhizae. So the mycorrhizae help the plant get water and nutrients, and in return, the plant gives them food, organic carbon, to keep them alive and happy. And what we're also finding out now is that if you actually look at forest soils, you'll find most of our native hardwood trees, with a few exceptions, have this symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizae. And in addition, mycorrhizae can kind of grab roots of other mycorrhizae on another tree, a neighboring tree. And sometimes what you'll see is that when one tree is suffering, neighboring trees will actually send nutrients and water through their roots, through their mycorrhizae network, into that suffering neighboring tree to help prop it up and make it a little bit more successful. So when we're looking at a forest, it kind of raises the question, are we looking at an assemblage of individual tree species, or are we looking at sort of one macro species where everything is cooperating and coordinating through interconnections with roots and mycorrhizae? That's kind of an interesting conceptual idea, but there's a lot of weird, cool stuff and a lot of cool connections occurring under the ground. So, going back to the effects of texture. The point of this is, again, you can't really change your texture, but you can change the amount and the type of organic matter that you have within your soil. If you can boost up the amount of organic, the amount of organic matter you have within your soil, and really get that soil food web and thus the nutrient cycle really cycling around at a high rate, processing a lot of material, and liberating a lot of nutrients. It doesn't so much matter what texture you have originally. So the negatives that you have with really sandy texture where it doesn't hold nutrients very well, that can be greatly ameliorated by making sure that you have a nice, healthy soil food web by adding a lot of organic matter to your soil. Again, organic matter is the base of that soil food web. So if you're adding good organic matter, good food source for the soil food web, it'll be strengthening the entire soil food web and thus the nutrient cycle as well too. Whether you have a clayey soil that already holds and retains nutrients well, or a sandy soil that does not hold or retain nutrients well. So if you want to counteract effects of bad texture on your nutrient holding capacity, the solution isn't to change your texture. The solution is to improve the nutrient cycle within your soil by boosting that soil food web through the addition of organic. What else does the organic factor do? Organic matter is very important in creating another important physical characteristic of soil. We talked about soil texture before. This other physical characteristic is called soil structure, which is basically a fancy way for saying how do those soil solids clump together? How do they aggregate? Which again, doesn't sound like it should be all that important, but it really is. This is what soil looks like if we actually start digging through it. Again, from a distance, you look in a soil pit, it looks like a solid. You start picking through there, if you get a little knife and start picking soil particles out of a wall soil pit, you'll see that they naturally come out as these little clumps. Granular structure up here is what we will find in a healthy topsoil. Blocky structure is often what we find in a healthy subsoil. Unfortunately, in our urban areas, we also find a lot of clayey structure, which is usually a sign of, well, often a sign of compaction. And then those last two, massive and single grain, those are basically structureless soils. A massive soil is basically a soil that's all just one big block. A single grain soil is a soil that doesn't clump together at all, just loose individual particles of sand, silt, and clay that don't adhere to itself. You don't see a lot of single grain soil, but the beach again is another great example of single grain soil. So pick up that beach sand, what happens? It just runs through your finger. It doesn't clump together at all. It's basically pure sand, and it doesn't have any of that stickiness to it that silt and clay have. When you fill up your soil with a lot of pores, a lot of soil structure, we call each of those little individual structural units, each of those little aggregates or clumps, we call that a ped. A well-structured soil consists of heads, and in between one head, its neighbors are macropores that separate them. Inside each head are micropores. The macropores allow air and water to quickly flow from the surface down into the rooting depth. So they're like the highways of the soil. And the micropores within the heads are like the little tiny capillary pores. They whip material up, especially water, and hold it there for a good long time. So one of the reasons that soils can still have plenty of water for plants, even when it's been, a couple days or even a couple weeks since the last rain. So good structure leads to good pores leads to good infiltration of air and water and good retention of air and water. So a well-structured soil, like this one, let's say we've got nice blocky subsoil here. When it rains, it's supposed to do tomorrow, rain falls on that well-structured soil, it's got plenty of pores to follow down, and it will allow that water to quickly absorb down into the soil and then be accessible to the roots. On the other hand, we have a more clayey soil, which maybe this soil created this soil. Maybe this was a soil that was in a farm field that was well managed or out in pasture or in a forest. And then someone bought that property and turned it into trap housing. And they ran over it with a lot of construction machinery and other heavy stuff. But what happens is that soil gets packed down, compacted. Those nice, loose, blocky beds now get squished down into these much tighter plates, much more interlocked plates. What happens on this compacted, clayey structured soil when that same rainfall hits? A little of that water flows down, but a lot more of it gets stuck at the surface just because there's not nearly as many of those big macropores to allow that water to percolate down. There's a few here and there, but as a result, we're seeing a lot more water stay on the surface. We can become stormwater. Now, the bacteria and the fungi play a very important role in creating these beds and this good structure. Bacteria and fungi, as they break down organic matter, they create soil humus. Humus is basically like finished compost. Humus is very sticky. During the breakdown process, bacteria and fungi create sticky byproducts as well too. These sticky materials, fungus and byproducts, act like natural glues that allow the soil to adhere, clump together. It's kind of one of the glues that creates the nucleus of these soil heads. In addition, we have all these larger organisms that burrow their way through the soil. Earthworms are probably the most obvious example, but the roots of the plants themselves are constantly growing and dying back. When they do, they leave behind pore space. So we've got this balance of materials and organisms in the soil that are creating sticky material that allows the soil to adhere. And we've also got other organisms that are burrowing their way through the soil and constantly creating new pore spaces. Sort of the combination of those two forces is what allows, to a large part, that soil structure to form. We need something to cause things to stick together, but if it was all just sticky material, we just have one big chunk of soil. We also need burrowers to go through and create those pore spaces between each individual bed. And this is what our soil, living organic material, does. So, if you have, again, a healthy soil food web, lots of organic matter, you will help to create a good structured soil that has very good infiltration capacity. Because again, you've got the organisms that are breaking down organics and making the natural glues to cause the soil to stick together, as well as the burrowing organisms that are eating bacteria and fungi, things like that, and the happy plant roots that are constantly growing through the soil creating new pore spaces that allow for that air and water to pass through. So again, proper management of your soil organic matter, which feeds the whole soil food web, will help to create good soil structure. So in that way, you get good infiltration capacity, good ability of that soil to absorb water and air, pass it from the surface down into the rooting zone to make your plants happy as well. Will also cut down on stormwater runoff on the surface. And again, it doesn't depend on the initial texture that you have. So sandy soils often don't really need this help. They're very good at absorbing material from the surface to begin with. But if you had a really clayey soil in this case, and that clay soil is very dense and sticky, and it was causing a lot of stormwater runoff because the water couldn't pass down into that soil very quickly. The solution again is not to add sand and try and make it a sandier soil. The solution is to add organic matter and get that soil food web up and running so you can get good soil structure. And lastly, probably the most obvious benefit of adding organics to your soil is the effect that it has on the ability of that soil to retain water. So again, we have down here on our x-axis our soil texture. So imagine we're going from a really sandy soil, adding more fine materials and ending up in a really clay soil. We have our loams in between. So it's starting from pure beach sand, we're adding silts and clays until we get that nice mix of all three. It's a loam. And we keep adding clay, subtracting those gritty materials until we get up to a very, very clay, almost pottery-like soil. As we go from a sandy to a clay soil, the ability of that soil to hold water.
I'm gonna go get a shirt
is
on.
very good for water.
So
But it's not the total volume of water
It
that we
looks like-
have in our soil that's important. It's
No,
the
I meant-
amount of water that's
It's
available.
recording your time watching it.
No.
Because this is what we do with the DEA training. Everyone just puts it on. and people watch.
Someone online might need
You're
to
like,
use
"Was there
their
this with this?"
microphone.
He listens to it.
Probably don't know.
Should be able to mute everyone on.
Or do you have any, I don't see us going out to dinner with anyone tonight. Don't know that we need to go out to dinner, but you have any thoughts about what we would want to eat?
No, cut my head. I saw you put the recipe out for the.
Well, ideas. We could,
On the top
the
part,
tortellini tonight. You know, we may get too bad.
Yeah, so
See the mute all button?
Mute them. There you go.
And get a special treat.
And you're not muted, right?
No, I'm still. All right,
Well, perfect.
doing some technology. So it's not the total volume of water that's held in soil that's really important. What's important is the amount of water that's available to the plant roots. So clay is very interesting. It holds the most water, but it doesn't hold the most plant available water. So there's two really water states that are important. First one is field capacity. The second one is the wilting point. Wilting point is probably pretty obvious. The wilting point doesn't mean that there's no water in the soil, but it means that the volume of water in the soil isn't enough to give the plants what they need. Because water is attracted to the surfaces of clay, organic matter, even some silts and sands as well too. And when the water level in your soil gets smaller and smaller and smaller, that water is held in a very tightly bonded sphere, kind of a thin film on the surface of your clay. And it's held very tightly that the plants don't have the energy, their roots don't have the energy to suck it up. It's more attracted to the sands, clays, silts than it is to the suction power of the root. So there's actually quite a bit of water in the soil, even when the plants are wilting. It's just held so tightly that the plants don't have access to it. The thing about clay is it attracts a lot of water, but it attracts it and bonds it fairly strongly. So at the wilting point for clay is actually very high. There's a lot of water in the soil, but clay is so good at bonding that water to its surface that it's not sharing it with the plants. Whereas sand, on the other hand, has almost no wilting point whatsoever. Any water that's available in a really sandy soil is available to the plant. The issue with sand is there's very little water available at all because sand doesn't hold much water, period. So what water it holds, it makes available, but the total volume that it holds is very small. That's where the field capacity comes in. So the field capacity is basically the maximum amount of water that a soil can hold against the tug of gravity. When water enters the soil during rainstorm, snow melt, whatever it is, percolates down through the soil. Some of it is bonded to the surface of the soil, other just passes down and goes to the groundwater. Think of soil like a sponge. You buy that dry sponge from Safeway or whatever your supermarket is, unwrap it. Let's say you put it under your faucet, but you turn that faucet on very slow, so it's just a drip. What happens for the first 30 seconds or so? The sponge begins to expand, it's absorbing that water, the water is bonding to the dry material in the sponge and being held there. The sponge is very absorptive, just like soil is. After about 30 seconds, all the pore spaces in the sponge are totally saturated. There's no more room for water. So water drips in from the faucet and then another drip of water comes out of the bottom. So just no more storage space. You turn off that faucet and that water is going to drip out for another 10, 15 seconds or so. And then it's going to stop. That's basically field capacity right there when the dripping stops. Gravity is pulling that water down out of the sponge, or it's trying to, but the sponge is also attracted to the water is also attracted to the surface of the sponge. And at a certain point, the most loosely held water is being pulled out by gravity because the force of gravity is stronger than that water's attraction to the sponge. But then after it stops dripping, it means the water that's retained in that sponge is more attracted to the surface of the sponge than the pull of gravity. It's being more drawn in by the sponge itself. That's what field capacity is. Basically, all the really loosely held water is drained out. The rest of the water is more attracted to sands, silts, and clays. That bond is stronger than the pull of gravity. This usually happens about 2 or 3 days after a long, heavy, soaking, saturating rain. All that really loosely held water is percolated out and gone to the groundwater at that point. Everything else is held in the soil and it's available to the plants. So plant available water is the difference between the wilting point, the volume of water held at the wilting point, and the volume of water held at field capacity. So for plant health, where those two bars on this graph are furthest separated, that's the type of soil texture that has the most plant available water. And it's usually some type of loam. So even though clay holds the most water in total, it's holding it very tightly. The plant available water is actually quite a bit less than what you would find in the loams. When we get down to the sands, it has the least plant available water just because it holds very little water to begin with. So remember, it's the difference between the wilting point and the field capacity that's important. Water held between those two states is what is available to the roots. If we take any of these textures and we add organic matter, composted organic matter, nice humus, to any of these soils, whether it's a sandy texture, a loamy texture, or a clay texture, two things happen. Yeah. So humus is very similar to clay in that it holds a lot of water. It's dissimilar to clay in that it holds a lot of water at low suction. It's not greedy with its water like clay. It holds it, but it holds it lightly. So the water that organic matter does hold, most of it is available to the plants because it's not bonded very, very strongly to the surface of that humus. So we take a lot of humus, we add it to our sands, our loams, or our clays, any texture. It greatly increases the field capacity of that soil, the volume of water that can be held when the soil is really, really full of water. And it only slightly increases the wilting point because humus is very generous with the water it holds. It shares it readily with the plants. So in effect, we're creating a much greater separation between these two bars, between the field capacity bar and the wilting point bar, which means that there's more plant available water, regardless of whatever your original soil texture was. So that is one of the reasons that organic matter additions to your soil are so important. Organic matter rich soil holds a lot of water that is available to the plants. So again, effects of texture, we have a really sandy soil, or we have even a really clayey soil. I kind of buried the lead a little bit. This is the water holding capacity, which is total. It's not the plant available water holding capacity. If we add organic matter to clay soil or organic matter to a sandy soil, you will increase the plant available water holding capacity of either of those two soils. So in that way, organic matter additions can negate the effects of bad texture as well. So now we're out looking at a soil. When we dig a deep enough pit, we can see some of the depth, the first couple feet of depth. What's that soil going to look like? Our soils form natural layers, kind of like a layer cake that we look at. We call each of these layers a horizon. Our horizon at the top. Horizon is actually on the surface. A lot of people don't even think of it as being part of the soil, but it's a loose organic litter on the surface. So those dead leaves on the surface of your forest really good example of the yellow plants. The A horizon is where most people think of soils forming or starting. That is our first subsurface layer. It's our organic matter rich topsoil. So that nice dark material up there. We have the E horizon sometimes. I'd say about half of our soils have an E horizon. It's kind of this leached pale layer that can form below the A horizon. E stands for exit. Things weather out of there. Natural acids cause materials just to weather and leach out. Those materials that leach out of the E horizon, they move down to the B horizon. It's usually our most colorful layer. That's our red Virginia clay. So if you're digging hard red stuff in your lawn, it's probably because you're down in the B horizon. You get a lot of clay, you get a lot of iron oxides, which cause that red, orange, and yellow color in the soil. Below that is our C horizon. Oh, sorry. What am I doing here to show you?
Yay.
There's the C horizon, that's the border layer between the soil and the rock. Basically, that's rock that's just beginning to break down, physically pulverized, but not chemically weathered yet. So it's basically small pulverized pieces of bedrock. Dusty. Then there's your R horizon, which is solid bedrock. Which again could be 2 to 4 feet from the surface, like around here, or a couple hundred feet from the surface. A healthy soil and plant system will have an A horizon with a lot of organic matter with that nice granular structure. Those granular structures, they kind of look like great nut cereal. You know what those are. Sometimes you're spreading aside the grass blades on your lawn, you look down on the surface, you can actually see those little granules right on the surface, especially if you have a lot of earthworms. Within that A horizon, you've got lots and lots and lots of microbes. The A horizon and healthy soil around here is pretty thin. Just naturally around here, we're lucky to get 2 to 4 inches of A horizon. That's plenty. Even within that 2 or 4 inches, that is the biological powerhouse of the soil. So within those 2 or 4 inches, you've got tons and tons and tons of microbes that are breaking down organic matter and in the process releasing nutrients. There's that good granular structure. That structure is really good at allowing quick passage of air and water from the surface down into the soil, down to the plant roots, and to the microbes. And as the water percolates down through the soil, it dissolves nutrients, and this allows for, again, the nutrients to be taken up by the plants. Because plants only take up water and oxygen from the soil. So any nutrients they take up have to be dissolved in the soil. The more water can get down into the soil, the more of those nutrients will dissolve. This makes the plants healthy. They're taking in all the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium they need from the soil. This creates more growth. More growth of the plants means more organic matter being ultimately deposited down onto the soil, refreshing the A horizons. You can see how this cycle occurs. But what happens when we're in an urban area like we are around here? We only have to go outside and see all the construction work that's occurring around this campus to see what can happen to soil in urban areas. Well, we get a lot of compaction. So that nice loose granular soil, if you run it over with a backhoe, it's going to be packed down quite a bit. And a lot of those fairly delicate soil pads, soil aggregates are going to get crushed. When soil is compacted, changes. Used to be 25% air, 25% water, 50% solid. We pack it down and it might look a little more like this. Now, 75% solid, the other 25% is taken by air and water. So those pore spaces get squeezed out under the weight of that packing force. So we get a significant loss in pores. When we have a significant loss in pores, this reduces the ability of air and water to infiltrate down into the soil with that platy, dense texture. I call this impervious life. Impervious surfaces, asphalt, concrete, rooftop, something that doesn't let any water pass through. Compaction is like semi-impervious. Some water passes through, but not nearly as much. This is a kind of typical scene of newer suburbs. Got the subdivision built, and then the last thing developers do is they come in and they plant some nice street trees. This is great. If we come back in 30 years, hopefully this pin-up will be much, much larger. But I think in a lot of cases, you come back 20, 50 years down the bend, that plant's not going to be too much different. Why is that? Well, it's got its little root ball growing there, but surrounding it is highly compacted soil. Certainly under the roadway, under the sidewalk, very compacted. But even in that strip of grass in between, that soil has been packed down by a lot of construction machinery, graded out. It might be very, very tough, very, very hard. It might, in some cases, get so hard that the plant roots don't have the energy to push through it and invade that sort of raw soil around them. So in a way, you kind of created just a little box or a little planting zone where the roots can grow, but if they can't grow out of that, Tree is only as big as its roots. It's got to have a big root mass in order to see big growth on the top. So if the roots are stunted, the rest of the tree is stunted. Oops. Yep, there we go. This can be very clearly seen in this scene right here. This is Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and Capitol. These are all willow oaks, probably planted, I assume, at the same time. But look how much bigger the willow oaks on the right are compared to the ones on the left. And none of those are sitting in particularly good soil, but at least these ones on the right have this swath of about 40 or 50 feet of soil available for their roots to grow into between the sidewalk and the house. These other ones are in these little tree boxes that are sandwiched between the roadway and this very wide sidewalk. So again, there's soil underneath the roadway and there's soil underneath the sidewalk, but it's really, really compacted there. So in effect, the roots are very constrained. They don't have the energy to spread out underneath that compacted soil. And as a result, they're very stunted. And you can see the stunting that occurs with the growth of as well too. And they're probably never going to get much healthier. In urban areas, soil gets mixed as well too. So again, naturally soil forms these various layers, these horizons, topsoil on top, where most of the, or I should say the most concentrated biological activity occurs. But when something is developed, all those layers get mixed together when that site is getting graded out. And this causes that fertile topsoil, which again is only about 2 or 4 inches deep naturally around here, to get sort of spread out and mixed throughout the first couple feet of soil, really dispersed. When you start from something like this is a bit of an extreme example, and you end up with something like this where it's a bit more homogenized. And the problem is when you don't have that concentration of organics, humus, fine plant roots, microbes, all concentrated in the first couple of inches, it really affects the ability of the health of the soil, and the number and health of the organisms participating in the soil through web soil. When you disperse that topsoil, you're also dispersing the soil through web. Great example. So this kind of makes us think back on what our definition of soil really is from the beginning of this presentation. Is it really the intersection of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere? Is it a mix of sand, silt, and clay? Well, yes, it is those things. But if we just think of soil as that, it's kind of redundant. These are sort of the raw ingredients, as we go. It's really the role of soil, the role it plays in our life and the life of the environment, that is probably more important thing. So it is a mix of sand, silt, and clay, but it's also a rich, very diverse ecosystem and food web, complex food web. It's a great recycler of materials, both organic matter and nutrients. And in effect, all those three things kind of mean soil is like the digestive system, the digestive tract of the world. It's like the stomach of the world. You add raw ingredients into it, it decomposes those raw ingredients and extracts the nutrients that are necessary for growth. So how do you keep this stomach happy? Same with your own stomach. Feed it. Put good food into it. Feed it with a lot of good quality food. What does it eat? It doesn't eat fertilizer. Fertilizer is important in certain respects, but fertilizer is it's a nutrient, it's basically a vitamin. Food is organic matter. You wake up in the morning, you really want breakfast, you pop a bunch of Centrum Silvers or some other multivitamin, great for you. You're still gonna be hungry though, right? That's why you need a waffle or toast or something like that. Because that waffle, that toast, that egg, whatever it is you're eating for breakfast, that has organic carbon in it, organic matter. It's the organic carbon that gives you energy. The vitamins will give you nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, zinc, and calcium. Those are all well and good. Sometimes you do need those if you have a deficiency. That's what fertilizer is for. It's to correct nutrient deficiencies. But it's not food. It does not contain that organic carbon, that organic matter that gives the soil microbes their energy. But something like compost does. That's pretty much pure organic matter. You can make compost in your own backyard too. You don't need to go out and buy it. And there are some products that sort of bridge the gap between fertilizer and soil food as well too. Manures are a good example, either fresh or composted, or Borgonite, which is an old product, it's been sold for about 100 years. That's actually treated Milwaukee municipal sewage sludge. So we've been adding manure to our soil for a long, long time, human manure. This stuff contains a pretty concentrated amount of nutrients like a fertilizer does, but it also contains a lot of organic matter. So it's got a foot in both worlds. Bit of a fertilizer while also a bit of a soil food as well too. Just remember, soil food has to have that organic matter, that organic carbon in it. And if you don't want to compost your own, you don't want to go out and buy something like Milorganite or a bag of composted barnyard manure, that's okay too. There's other ways, simpler ways to add organic matter to your soil. One of the simplest would be to mow in your leaves in the fall. Instead of breaking your back and spending all those hours, sometimes even days, depending on the size of your yard, to rake those leaves off, reveal your grass, bring those leaves to the curb, so some big vacuum truck can suck them up, or throw them into the woods in the back. Why not just run them over with your lawnmower, chip them down to the smaller sizes, and by the time they get chipped down, those little chipped up leaves actually settle between the grass blades and won't smother your lawn. If you got 18 or 24 inches of leaves on your lawn, yeah, you're probably gonna have to remove some of them, but maybe some of them you can chip in. Even simpler than this, certainly don't bag up and take away your grass clippings. Leave them on the lawn, but decompose on the lawn and add organic matter down to your soil. You want to go a little bit heavier, a little bit more hardcore. This person is actually putting on a compost top dressing. Their landscaper came by, put all these little piles of compost, and the crew is going to come out with a rake it out to about 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thickness or so. Basically, just a thin blanket of compost on the surface that's not thick enough to smother the grass. It settles down between the grass blades, and the earthworms and other burrowers in the soil will naturally, over the next couple of weeks, nicely incorporate that down to your soil. Or perhaps even the simplest way to feed it is probably the way that you're already feeding it. That's the plant. Lots of growing things. Maximize the amount of living plants on the surface and maximize the time of year that you have living plants growing on the surface. So as plants grow, the roots work their way down into the soil like little fingers running everywhere. And they exude organic matter into the soil to feed the soil microbes. So by just having plants on the surface, you actually are increasing the organic matter content of your soil. In addition, you have a lawn like this, you're adding probably a wood mulch, maybe that's a leaf mulch, I can't quite tell from the picture. But that mulch is also slowly decomposing in place, and that's adding organic matter down to your soil as well too. And if you can, keep the plant residues on site instead of trimming everything up and taking them off site. And you can chip them down real small and keep them on site, just let them rot in place, throw them into a compost pile, and when that compost is finished, reapply it back to the areas where you took it from. And that way, you're making sure that you're kind of recreating the organic matter cycle that we see in a natural forest, where all the leaves fall on the ground and replenish the soil. By doing this, you are greatly increasing the amount of organic matter. That, again, is the base of your soil food web. The more organic matter you have going into the soil, the bigger, more active, and more cycling your soil food web is going to be. This feeds the bacteria and fungi, the decomposers. These guys feed basically everything else within the soil food web as well. Got a good soil food web, got a good nutrient cycle. Got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, zinc, all that necessary stuff cycling around your soil, becoming decomposed to the extent where it then can dissolve in the water and go back to the plants and feed them as well. You got your healthy soil. Just gonna run through this. Yeah, it gives you your good soil structure as well too. It's got all those roots and all those critters and burrowing organisms working their way through the soil, creating new pore spaces. We'll have to get to the end. The real lesson here is that a well-fed soil, fed well with organic matter, is a resilient soil that cycles nutrients and carbon well. Give the soil food web organic matter, let them do the work for you. Good. Any questions or? Yes.
So just, some of the areas in my yard are heavily compacted, right? Just grass grown on it marginally, and to try and boost it back to even recover it, right? Do you recommend any rototilling and adding organic matter to the top before you plant? Generally, we found like if we're going to seed or something else, we almost need to disturb it and work some stuff in so it's not so impervious.
I think as long as they're adding organic matter during the disturbance, so like I said, rototilling or rototilling in compost or leaf mulch or something like that, that's where There should be a point at which it becomes decompacted enough that the plants can just start growing naturally. And then at that point, when getting the growth you want from the plants, it's probably best just, because the plants will then take care of the rest through their root action. Yeah, but sometimes you do need to help it along at first, especially if you're starting from a really compacted base.
And so you would add compost at that point. I've heard that peat moss is really not good at breaking it down.
I usually don't recommend peat moss, just because it's not a very renewable material either. It takes a long time to create peat moss. And it can be a little acidic at times, so yeah, just, the natural compost you can purchase locally is probably made from stuff locally as well. So it should match our soil as well. Not a specific one. Again, I think anything that you buy locally, you can get compost from the landfill for free in some cases. Usually it's more like a leaf mulch, kind of partially composted leaves. That's great because it's free, but it hasn't been composted thoroughly enough to kill all the weed seeds, and you might have some weed seeds in there. Whereas if you buy compost from a certified retailer, they usually have a system that keeps the compost heats itself up as it's decomposing. If it gets to a certain level, it kills off the weed seeds. So you probably pay a bit of a premium for that product, but you will also be a little more certain of what's in.
If you live in Prince William County, there's a composting facility that is very efficient and does everything.
Have you spread that stuff?
Yes,
Yeah, free state farms in
Yeah.
Falls.
you can either bring your own container or you can buy it by the bag.
They sell bags.
Yeah, they sell bags.
Falls
Off
Forward.
of Allsford Road.
And I think their dirty secret is they sell a lot of the name brand compost that your bigger nurseries sell. Those nurseries go to them, they buy their compost, put it in their own bags and then sell it for twice as much. I'm not sure who it is, I've just heard that happens. So, but that's good though, it means you're getting really good compost at those other spots.
Before you guys ask any more questions, just a little reminder, before you leave, hand me your name tags, because we're gonna recycle those, right?
Yes, Linda.
So, sometimes folks will recommend if you have really compacted soil to use an aerator, a machine that brings up a little plug. Does that help to jumpstart getting the organic matter down into the soil and layer organics on top of that after you aerate the soil?
They can, again, usually what I say is once you've got a fairly healthy soil, I wouldn't recommend tilling, aerating at that point. But when you're starting from a very compacted base, which a lot of us are living in the burbs or in more urbanized areas, it can be useful to manually, mechanically decompact that
So
soil.
if things are doing okay, you don't recommend a core aeration?
Yeah.
I always kind of wondered.
Just see if you really had the disaster and you couldn't do anything, but that'd be a way to start.
Yes,
Get it going.
definitely, yes.